The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets of downtown Portland, where the aroma of freshly roasted coffee beans mingled with the crisp autumn air. Among the bustling crowd of well-dressed professionals hurrying to their offices, a woman in worn jeans and a simple gray hoodie walked quietly, her baseball cap pulled low over her face. She moved with an unhurried grace, pausing occasionally to admire the changing leaves or smile at a passing dog walker. What happened next would leave everyone completely speechless. Sandra Bullock had always cherished these rare moments of anonymity. After decades in the spotlight, she had perfected the art of blending in, no makeup, hair tucked away, clothes that whispered rather than shouted. This morning, she craved nothing more than a quiet cup of coffee and perhaps a warm pastry while she reviewed the script that had been weighing on her mind for weeks. The café she approached was a small, intimate space called the Daily Grind, wedged between a vintage bookstore and a local art gallery. Through the large windows, she could see exposed brick walls lined with local artwork, mismatched wooden tables and chairs that spoke of comfort over conformity, and a handful of patrons lost in their laptops or quiet conversations. It looked perfect, exactly the kind of place where a person could disappear into the background. As Sandra reached for the brass door handle, a sharp voice cut through the morning calm. "Excuse me, but I don't think this is the right place for you." She turned to find a man in his late 30s standing behind her, his perfectly pressed designer suit catching the morning light. His hair was styled with mathematical precision, and his shoes gleamed with the kind of polish that suggested they'd never touched anything rougher than marble. Gerald Morrison, though Sandra didn't know his name yet, was the type of man who measured his worth in the zeros of his bank account and the prestige of his zip code. "I'm sorry?" Sandra asked quietly, genuinely confused. Gerald's eyes swept over her appearance with undisguised disdain. "Look, I'm sure there are plenty of establishments more suited to your budget a few blocks down. This place caters to a certain clientele, if you understand my meaning." Sandra felt a familiar tightness in her chest, not the kind that came from recognition, but the older, deeper hurt of being judged solely on appearance. She'd experienced this before, in the early days of her career, when she'd show up to auditions in whatever she could afford, only to be dismissed before she could even read a line. "I just wanted some coffee," she said simply, her voice steady despite the sting of his words. "Coffee here runs $15 for a single cup," Gerald continued, clearly pleased with himself. "I'm just trying to save you the embarrassment of having to walk out when you see the prices." Through the window, Sandra noticed a few patrons had turned to watch the exchange, their faces showing varying degrees of discomfort and curiosity. She could walk away, should walk away probably, but something in Gerald's smug expression ignited a quiet determination in her. "I think I can manage $15, she replied calmly, reaching for the door again. Gerald stepped closer, lowering his voice to what he probably thought was a reasonable tone. "Listen, sweetheart, I'm trying to do you a favor here. This isn't McDonald's. The people inside?" He gestured toward the window. "They're executives, lawyers, doctors. They come here to network, to make deals worth more than you probably see in a year. You'll stick out like a sore thumb." Sandra studied his face for a moment, noting the way his jaw tensed with self-importance, the way his eyes never quite met hers when he spoke. "And what do you do?" she asked. "I'm in investment banking," Gerald replied, straightening his tie. "I make more in a month than most people see in a lifetime. I drive a Tesla, I have a penthouse downtown, and I wear suits that cost more than most people's rent. That's how you know someone belongs in a place like this." "Interesting philosophy," Sandra said, pulling her cap down slightly. "So you're saying a person's worth is measured by their bank account?" Gerald laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "In the real world? Absolutely. Money talks, everything else walks. You can't change the world with good intentions and positive thinking. You need capital, influence, connections, things that come from success, not from whatever it is you're doing." Despite herself, Sandra found herself settling into the conversation. There was something almost fascinating about Gerald's certainty, his complete conviction that his worldview was not only correct, but universally accepted. What if I told you that some of the most successful people I know dress exactly like I'm dressed right now? I'd say you're delusional, Gerald shot back. Successful people understand that image is everything. How you present yourself tells the world what you're worth. Dress like you're broke, and people will treat you like you're broke. It's basic psychology. But what if, Sandra continued patiently, what if the truly successful people are the ones confident enough not to need external validation? What if they're secure enough in who they are that they don't need to broadcast their worth through designer labels? Gerald's laugh grew sharper. That's a nice fairy tale, but I live in the real world. I network with millionaires, billionaires. Trust me, they all understand the importance of presentation. You think Elon Musk shows up to board meetings in jeans and a hoodie? Actually, Sandra said with a small smile, I think you might be surprised. Look, I get it, Gerald continued, his voice taking on a patronizing tone. Everyone wants to believe that money doesn't matter, that we're all equal. But equality is a myth. Some people are winners, some are losers. Some people make things happen, others just exist. And the sooner you accept which category you fall into, the happier you'll be. Sandra felt a flicker of something, not anger exactly, but a deep sadness for this man who had built his entire identity on such a hollow foundation. What happens when the money's gone? She asked quietly. When the suit gets old, when the car breaks down, when the penthouse lease expires, what's left? That's not going to happen, Gerald replied confidently, because I understand how the world works. I make smart investments, I network with the right people, I maintain my image. That's how you stay on top. But what if it did? Sandra pressed. What if tomorrow you lost everything? Would you still be the same person? For just a moment, Gerald's certainty flickered, but he quickly recovered, his expression hardening. That's exactly the kind of thinking that keeps people like you where you are. Instead of fantasizing about bringing successful people down to your level, maybe you should focus on elevating yourself. And how would you suggest I do that? First, get some decent clothes. Nothing screams failure like dressing like you just rolled out of bed. Second, start networking with better people, people who can actually help you instead of other people like yourself. Third, set some real goals. Not I want to be happy or I want to make a difference, but actual, measurable financial targets. Sandra nodded thoughtfully. Those are interesting priorities. But what about kindness? What about treating others with respect regardless of their circumstances? What about using whatever success you have to help people who might be struggling? Gerald's expression grew incredulous. That's exactly what I'm talking about. That bleeding heart mentality is what keeps people poor. You can't save everyone, and trying to will just drag you down with them. Successful people understand that resources are limited, and if you're giving yours away to charity cases, you're just handicapping yourself. So you don't believe in helping others? I believe in helping myself first, Gerald replied firmly. Once I've secured my own position, maybe I'll throw some money at a charity for the tax write-off. But this idea that we're all supposed to hold hands and sing Kumbaya, that's not how capitalism works, sweetheart. Around them, the morning crowd had begun to thin, but several people had stopped to listen to their conversation, drawn by Gerald's increasingly animated gestures and raised voice. Sandra noticed a young woman with a stroller who had paused nearby, her expression troubled as she listened to Gerald's words. "What about that woman over there?" Sandra asked, nodding toward the young mother. "What if she's having a hard time financially? Should she not deserve kindness or help?" Gerald glanced over dismissively. "She made her choices. If she can't afford to live the lifestyle she chose, that's not my problem. Everyone's responsible for their own success or failure. What if she's a single mother working 2 jobs to support her child? What if her husband died in military service? What if she's doing everything right but still struggling to make ends meet? What if, Gerald mocked. You can create sob stories for everyone if you try hard enough. The bottom line is that in America, if you're smart and you work hard, you succeed. If you don't succeed, it's because you're not smart enough or not working hard enough. It's that simple. Sandra felt her patience beginning to fray, not with anger but with genuine bewilderment at his worldview. So there's no room in your philosophy for circumstance? for bad luck, for systemic barriers, for the simple reality that some people face challenges others don't? Life isn't fair, Gerald shrugged. The sooner you accept that, the better off you'll be. Instead of making excuses for people who can't make it, maybe ask yourself why some people can rise above their circumstances and others can't. Maybe, Sandra said quietly, it's because some people have help when they need it and others don't. Maybe it's because some people are born into situations that give them advantages, and others have to work twice as hard just to reach the starting line. Gerald rolled his eyes. There you go again with the victimhood mentality. You know what separates winners from losers? Winners don't make excuses. They don't blame their circumstances or their upbringing or society. They take responsibility and they make things happen. And they never needed anyone's help along the way. Self-made millionaires didn't get handouts, Gerald insisted. They pulled themselves up by their bootstraps. Sandra almost smiled at the irony of the phrase, but she kept her expression neutral. What about teachers who believed in them? Parents who worked extra hours to pay for their education? Friends who offered encouragement when things got tough? Mentors who opened doors? None of that counts as help. That's different, Gerald said, though his voice carried less conviction than before. That's normal networking, building relationships that are mutually beneficial. So help is okay when it benefits you, but not when you're asked to help others? Gerald's face reddened slightly. You're twisting my words. I'm talking about enabling people versus empowering them. There's a difference between strategic networking and throwing money at problems. What if empowering someone sometimes looks like giving them a chance they wouldn't otherwise have? What if kindness itself is a form of investment, not in your own portfolio, but in the kind of world you want to live in? That's very poetic, Gerald said sarcastically, but poetry doesn't pay the bills. Doesn't it, though? Sandra asked. What about all the artists, writers, musicians who have changed the world? What about the teachers who inspire future leaders, or the social workers who keep communities together, or the volunteers who make sure nobody falls through the cracks? Their work might not show up on a stock ticker, but doesn't it have value? Gerald waved his hand dismissively. Sure, fine. Some people choose to make less money doing meaningful work, but they can't turn around and complain about being poor when they made that choice. What if they're not complaining about being poor? What if they're rich in ways that don't show up on a bank statement? Oh, please, Gerald scoffed. You can't eat satisfaction. You can't pay rent with good intentions. Money is the only currency that actually matters. Is it? Sandra asked. What about love? What about friendship? What about the respect of people whose opinions you value? What about the ability to sleep well at night knowing you've lived according to your principles? Those are luxuries for people who can afford them, Gerald replied. And you can only afford them if you have money first. The conversation was drawing more attention now. A small crowd had gathered, some pretending to check their phones while clearly listening, others openly watching with fascinated expressions. Sandra noticed an elderly man in a paint-splattered apron, probably from the art gallery, who was nodding along with her words, and a young professional who seemed to be reconsidering Gerald's philosophy with each exchange. Let me ask you something, Sandra said. When you're old and looking back on your life, what do you want to be remembered for? Gerald paused, seeming genuinely caught off guard by the question. For being successful, for building something, for winning. But what does that mean practically? What will you have built? Who will you have helped? What will the world be like because you were in it? I'll have created wealth, jobs, economic growth. For whom? For shareholders, for investors, for the economy. But what about for people? Individual human beings whose lives you touched. What stories will they tell about you? Gerald's confident facade began to crack slightly. Look, not everyone can be Mother Teresa, okay? Some of us have to focus on the practical side of making the world work. But what if the practical side includes treating people with dignity? What if economic success and human kindness aren't mutually exclusive? Because kindness doesn't scale, Gerald exploded, his voice rising enough to cause several passers-by to stop and stare. You can be kind to your family, your friends, maybe your neighbors, But you can't run a business or an economy on kindness. You need efficiency, competition, clear metrics for success and failure. Sandra remained perfectly calm, her voice a stark contrast to his agitation. What if kindness is actually more efficient than cruelty? What if treating employees well makes them more productive? What if customers are more loyal to businesses that treat them with respect? What if communities thrive when people look out for each other? That's idealistic nonsense, Gerald shot back. Show me one Fortune 500 company that got there by being nice. I could show you several, Sandra said quietly, but I think you might be surprised by what being nice actually looks like in practice. Gerald was about to respond when a voice called out from the cafe doorway. Sandra? Sandra Bullock? Both Sandra and Gerald turned to see a young barista standing in the doorway, his face bright with recognition and genuine warmth. Oh my God, I thought that was you. We're huge fans of your work. Would you like to come in? Your usual table by the window is free. The blood drained from Gerald's face as the words sank in. Sandra Bullock. The Sandra Bullock, Academy Award winner. Box office queen. One of the most beloved actresses in Hollywood, worth an estimated $250 million, standing right in front of him in jeans and a hoodie. Gerald started, then stopped, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Sandra smiled at the barista. That's very sweet of you, Marcus. I'll be right in. She turned back to Gerald, whose face had gone from red to pale in a matter of seconds. You're, he whispered. Someone who chose to dress comfortably for a morning coffee run, Sandra finished gently. Someone who could afford to buy this entire building, but who values kindness more than marble countertops. Someone who's had the privilege of success and tries to use it responsibly. Gerald stared at her, his entire worldview crumbling in real time. But you look so ordinary. Sandra's smile was gentle but pointed. Maybe that's because ordinary people are often extraordinary, and extraordinary people are often quite ordinary. Maybe appearances really don't tell us much about a person's worth. The crowd that had gathered was now openly staring, some recognizing Sandra, others just fascinated by the dramatic turn the conversation had taken. Gerald looked around at their faces, some amused, some sympathetic, all of them having witnessed his public humiliation. I had no idea, he stammered. I'm sorry, I didn't mean. What didn't you mean? Sandra asked, not unkindly, but not letting him off the hook either. You didn't mean that you think people should be judged by their appearance? You didn't mean that money is the only measure of worth? You didn't mean that successful people don't help others? Gerald's shoulders sagged. For the first time in the conversation, his arrogance was completely gone, replaced by something that looked almost like shame. You're right. I was completely out of line. I made assumptions, and I was wrong. What made you assume those things? Sandra asked. Gerald was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with the question. I guess I've been measuring my own worth by those standards for so long that I assumed everyone else did too. And maybe I was afraid that if those standards weren't true, then I'm not as valuable as I thought I was. It was, Sandra realized, the first truly honest thing he'd said all morning. Your value as a person has nothing to do with your bank account, she said softly. It has to do with how you treat others, how you use whatever gifts you've been given, whether you make the world a little better or a little worse by being in it. Gerald nodded slowly, looking genuinely chastened. I've been making it worse, haven't I? Today, maybe, Sandra agreed. But today doesn't have to define tomorrow. How do you do it? Gerald asked suddenly. How do you stay normal, kind, with everything you must have? Sandra considered the question seriously. I remember where I came from. I remember that success is partly talent, partly hard work, and partly luck, and the luck part is bigger than most people want to admit. I remember that I'm not inherently better than anyone else. I just had opportunities others didn't. And I try to use those opportunities to create more opportunities for other people. Is that why you dress like this? To stay humble? Sandra laughed, a genuine, warm sound. I dress like this because it's comfortable and because I like being able to move through the world without everyone staring at me. But also because I never want to forget that the person someone is inside matters more than what they wear outside. Gerald looked down at his expensive suit, his polished shoes, his designer watch. I spent $2,000 on this outfit, he said quietly. And there's nothing wrong with that, if you earned it honestly, and if it makes you feel good about yourself, Sandra replied. But it doesn't make you better than someone who shops at Target. It just makes you someone who shops differently. I made fun of you for looking poor. You made assumptions based on limited information. We all do that sometimes. The question is what we do when we realize we were wrong. Gerald was quiet for a moment, then looked up at her with something like wonder. You could have told me who you were right away. You could have made me look like an idiot in front of everyone. What would that have accomplished? Sandra asked. Humiliating you wouldn't have changed your mind about anything. It might have just made you more defensive, more convinced that successful people are cruel. But I was cruel to you. Yes, you were. But cruelty in response to cruelty just creates more cruelty. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is respond to meanness with kindness. Gerald shook his head slowly. I don't understand how you do that. If someone treated me the way I treated you, you'd probably want to hurt them back, Sandra finished. I understand that impulse. But I've learned that carrying anger around is like drinking poison and hoping the other person gets sick. It hurts you more than them. So you just forgive people? I try to understand them, Sandra said. Usually when someone's being cruel, it's because they're hurting or scared or insecure about something. That doesn't excuse the behavior, but understanding it makes it easier to respond with compassion instead of anger. Gerald looked at her with something approaching awe. No wonder you're successful. Sandra smiled. I'm successful because I've been lucky. I've worked hard, and I've had incredible people supporting me along the way. But I'd like to think I'm a good person because I try to remember that everyone has a story I don't know, everyone has struggles I can't see, and everyone deserves to be treated with basic dignity. Even investment bankers who act like jerks outside coffee shops? Especially investment bankers who act like jerks outside coffee shops, Sandra said with a grin. Because maybe they're just people who forgot, for a while, that everyone else is people too. The crowd that had gathered was beginning to disperse, but several people approached Sandra with warm smiles and requests for photos, which she graciously accommodated. Gerald watched as she interacted with each person, a construction worker, a young mother, an elderly woman walking her dog, with the same genuine warmth and attention she'd shown him, even after his rudeness. Sandra? Gerald called as she prepared to enter the café. She turned back to him. Yes? Thank you. For not giving up on me when I probably deserved it. Sandra's smile was radiant. Everyone deserves kindness, Gerald, even when they forget to show it themselves. As she disappeared into the café, Gerald stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, watching through the window as she settled at a corner table with her script and a simple cup of coffee. The barista brought her a muffin, probably on the house, and she thanked him with the same genuine appreciation she might show a five-star server. For the first time in years, Gerald found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about success, about worth, about what it meant to be a good person in the world. He looked down at his expensive suit and for the first time felt a little ridiculous. Then he walked into the cafe, ordered a $15 coffee, and asked the barista if he knew of any local charities that might need volunteers. It was, he decided, time to learn a different way of measuring success. Inside, Sandra looked up from her script and caught his eye through the window. She raised her coffee cup in a small salute, her smile saying what words couldn't, that it's never too late to choose kindness, never too late to change, never too late to remember that the best investment you can make is in your own humanity. And in that moment, Gerald understood that true wealth wasn't about what you could buy. It was about what you could give, what you could build, and how many lives you could touch in a way that made them better. The morning sun climbed higher over Portland, casting new light on old assumptions, and two strangers who had started as adversaries ended as fellow travelers on the long journey toward becoming better versions of themselves.